Gregg Mitman. I am one of the organizers of this Andrew Mellon Foundation funded seminar, the Jordan Sawyer Seminar, and Interrogating the Plantationocene, along with my colleagues Pablo Gomez, Monique Allawert. Huge thanks also to Jackie Tua, who's been really helping us with a lot of the logistics of this seminar. It's great to see such a full house here today. And hopefully you've been a part of the conversations that have already been ongoing this week. Today it's a little more intimate setting, although not that much more intimate given the size of the crowd. And we have people that are also joining us live stream, and happy to have people participating from near and afar in this conversation. The seminar runs for all the way till April 2020, 8 workshops, really thinking about the plantation and its histories and its contemporary legacies over the course of really 500 years of history. So the first workshop was on the Anthropocene, this one on the Capitalocene, and then April 18th and 19th, Donna Haraway and Anat Singh will be joining us to be thinking about the Plantationocene. So the first 3 workshops are trying to really put these different scenes that are out there in conversation with each other. And then next year, the next academic year, we'll be digging deeper into the plantations themselves and thinking about categories around land, labor, capital, sensoria, and other dimensions. We'll also be having we'll be having an art exhibition at the Chazen, as well as some exhibitions in the libraries and special collections that will be happening next year. It's a great pleasure to have 3 distinguished speakers and panel today. I'm not going to go into lengthy introductions, so Michelle Murphy is joining us from the University of Toronto, where she is a professor of history and women and gender studies, so directs the Technoscience Research Unit there. Jason Moore is joining us from Binghamton University, where he is a professor of sociology, and Shona Jackson is an associate professor of English joining us from Texas A&M. So thank you so much for coming and for already kicking off the conversation last evening. All of them generously shared work with us to think about and discuss and put in conversation with each other. So the format of this morning is that we've asked each of them to just give us 5 minutes of remarks that help frame the paper and maybe raise some important themes that think about the Capitalocene, but also in relationship to thinking about plantations and the concept of the Plantationocene. So we'll have opening remarks from them, and then we're going to switch up the format a little bit from the last time, where we're just going to open it up to all of you, and really first try and entertain questions from grad students in the seminar before we open it up to the wider community. We'll go for till about 10:15, take a short break for 10 minutes, but people should feel free to get up and have coffee, get some snacks at any time during the conversation. So do you want to start us off, Michelle? Or?
Sure. I guess I sat in the right spot
Yeah.
to start. Thank you, Greg, and it's nice to see everyone here. I instantly want to all this into like circles, and so we could sit and look at each other, but I hoped I get to learn about some of the great work that's happening in this room as the morning goes on. The shared with you as part of a project about Chemical Valley in Canada, and Chemical Valley is where some 40% of Canada's petrochemicals are processed. Some of the things that I'm thinking about that I think I want to put on the table for our discussion is the relationship between settler colonialism and capitalism. And here, one of the things that we're really relevant with in this project, which takes many forms, is the relation between corporations and what they do and their logics, and the settler state and its responsibility for allowing violence. Underneath this and undergirding this, to my thinking, is really old legal forms like the doctrine of discovery, the issue of terra nullius, that which is considered empty, or we could say wastable, and also the doctrine of entitlement to violence that is not called violence, that is based in a Christian theology and governance that underwrites settler colonialism in the Americas, for which the enslaving and killing of people does not count as a violence. And so we can think of these structures as really undergirding, I think, a world that a permission to pollute world that we've built, in which the settler state creates laws that allow corporations to pollute up to this much, or in the case of Chemical Valley, up to this much. So pollution by the ton. And the corporation is aligned with the idea of that which is empty, which can be wasted, and which can be eliminated. And so in the case of Chemical Valley, it's on Anishinaabe land. The Amjadong First Nation is on this land. It's their land. And Chemical Valley creates over 150 years of ongoing fossil fuel capitalist pollution. So some of the kind of questions on a more abstract level we can think about is Chemical Valley is at the top of the St. Clair River. So the St. Clair River goes, we can think of this waterway starting at Lake Huron, the Great Lakes, going down to Lake Erie. At the top is Sarnia and Chemical Valley. This is where the first oil wells are, the first commercial oil fields are built. This is where the world's oil refinery is. So that aspect of fossil fuel capitalism really gets articulated here, as well as simultaneously in other places, but in this spot. Go down the river, we're at Detroit. We're at the invention of Fordism. We're at the invention of certain kinds of industrial capital, and not just industrial capital, but racial capital and its formulation as a Fordist industrial project. So on this one river, we have the meeting of settler colonialism and racial capitalism. If we look across the river, so on one side is Ontario, one side is Michigan. On the Michigan side, we have Flint. So this area is really an important place to be theorizing about the relationship between settler colonialism and racial capitalism. In the piece that you read, one thing that we're trying to figure out is how, if we think chemical pollution is an articulation of settler colonialism in this capitalist form, then how might we rethink the very ways that science or environmental justice work that science or uses science might understand what pollution is, what a chemical is. In our work, we really try to activate Anishinaabe as well as Shona and Métis, understandings of land, understandings of ethical relation, understandings of temporal relation, so responsibilities to ancestors, responsibilities to those yet to come, in our thinking about what would be a way to bring a different vision of justice, a different vision of ethics to what chemicals are and how we're supposed to call pollution and polluters into responsibility. So something that Gregg gave our introduction, just the title of my position at the University of Toronto, but I'm Métis from Winnipeg. I live in Toronto. Our lab is an Indigenous-led, Indigenous majority lab, where we're trying to do decolonial science studies, having Indigenous and people of color study settler colonial science as it manifests in the fossil fuel industry of the refineries in Chemical Valley.
Okay, thank you. Just one thing to mention at the beginning is that there's a sign-up list circulating, and please be sure to sign that. So there's many people that are trying to get into this workshop, so it's good for us to be able to know who's actually coming. So, Shona, do you want to offer some opening remarks?
Sure. So what I submitted for the discussion today is an excerpt from a chapter in a book that is trying to sort of grapple with the sort of excision from Indigenous peoples' labor from Caribbean labor history. And so the chapter that this piece is excerpted from is focused on creating a method or a way of approaching labor. And in order to do that, it tries to actually create space around the term labor. And I use Hannah Arendt's work to establish that. What I do in the excerpt that you have is I begin by looking at the category labor and the specific ways in which it manages what Arendt sees as a distinction that's germane to modern political economy, and that is the contrast between labor and work. So what I find in my own work is that the distinction is central to the disappearance of Indigenous peoples' labor history, or labor histories, and so I approach those histories not from the point at which they are already foreclosed, but in Arendtian terms, as they exist in terms of or through an ongoing labor work dialectic that organizes actions, bodies, histories, and histories into productive and unproductive outcomes. So the larger chapter mobilizes the division to rethink a specific way in which, or point at which, Black labor history becomes delinked in the Caribbean from Indigenous labor history, and that is actually conversion. So the religious principle, basically that sort of governed a lot of the discoveries at in the 15th century. And so what I try to do is actually look at conversion. It's also the thing that, and I'll truncate this here, but it's the thing that actually delinks Black and Indigenous bodies for all sorts of reasons. What I do is I try to approach it as just and an economic phenomenon in which we see what are considered the unproductive bodily labors of Blacks and Indigenous peoples being confirmed or transformed into productive work. It produces a sort of transportation. As I see it, it produces a dialectic of labor and work, of abundance and scarcity, that again puts Blacks and Indigenous peoples on either side of the dialectic, and so their histories can't exist or operate within the same time. I'll admit that this work does not come out of any sort of discussion in my own work of the Capitalocene, the Anthropocene, or the Plantationocene, but in trying to create space between labor or trying to work in the space between labor and work, the project is actually trying to recover bodily actions that we don't have a good way of capturing or designating, even as unpaid work, even as in terms of the unpaid work that's instrumental to but that those sort of bodily actions that actually exist as a perpetual outside, like how do we grasp those, how do we think about those, what are the limits of the language that we have, that we presently have for bodily actions. So that's what it is.
Okay, thank you.
That's great. All right,
Awesome.
A few remarks about the Capitalocene. I think it's easy to think the Capitalocene does too much, and I think it's easy to do way too little with the Capitalocene. Ultimately, the Capitalocene it's not only a geopoetic, so a way of poking at the Anthropocene and the colonizers' mold inscribed in man versus nature. It's also a sympoetic, so becoming with, or what I would call dialectics. It is, it is a historiographical and an interpretive thesis about big turning points in the history of capitalism as a 5-century process. And it involves making visible what has been largely invisible in the environmental literature, which is characterized, with the exception, of course, of the valiant efforts of environmental historians and a few others, by an ahistorical conception of webs of life, of nature, of how power and political economy works. That is the extraordinary land-labor revolutions of the early modern centuries after 1450, and especially with the Colombian invasion of 1492, which is financed by Genoese capital. So we have to come to grips with this earlier moment, in my opinion, if we want to make sense of planetary crisis. That is, the origins do not, as often asserted, begin in England. They do not begin with coal and steam power and ingenious Englishmen between the 1790s and 1830s. We have to look at a longer durée that is one of many temporalities for sure, and we have to look at a sufficiently broad geographical scope that defies the old separation of civilization. At the same time, takes civility and savagery as the operative guiding real abstractions of early capitalism that emerge first through Iberian metaphysical instrumentalism and then achieve more familiar form with Descartes and English empiricism as they unfold in the 17th and 18th centuries. So, at its heart, what the Capitalocene argument does is it asks questions about how to connect what's been disconnected in the history of radical thought over the past century and radical historical analysis. That is the question of resistance and struggle and power and domination and the questions of capital. These are often, almost always still kept separated. In fact, they are intimately interconnected. This asks questions about how do we connect the conquest and capitalist transformation of the Americas, the making of Europe as a geohistorical actor. It asks questions about how do we connect the systems of coerced labor that are made and remade across the long sweep of capitalism, while enslaved indigenous and Africans are working on the plantations in the Americas. European women, as Federici shows, are working on the mantation in Europe. Slavs and Irish are subjected to deeply coercive relations that are constitutive of the rise of capitalism. It asks questions about how do we connect city and country? How do we connect the emergence not just of savagery and civility, to use the language time, and there are different ways of doing that in different languages. But also, how do we see that as shaping powerful binaries of race, of gender, of sexuality, of imperial and colonial life? That is, how is the cosmology of modernity fundamentally implicated in the practice of capital accumulation and domination over the long durée? So it is, and it also questions deeply, as I suggested, the mythology of the Industrial Revolution as a European-centered phenomenon. If there is a key machine and a key technology of that period, which is hugely important, it is not the steam engine, but the cotton gin and the genocide slavery complex of the American South, part of the second slavery, as Dale Tomich has helped us see. I think for me, that's a powerful example of what the Capitalocene allows us to do. It allows us to see very clearly what Marx observes as the oppression and domination and exploitation of wage workers within the circuit of capital, and the oppression and domination of workers outside, but directly serving capital in the form of slave labor. So it's deeply important. The plantations are crucial to this. I think it's important. I think it's important that we not, and I don't think that people are tempted to go in this way, but sometimes they are, go in a typological direction. Either you have mission creep where everything becomes a plantation, or you say, well, this is a plantation, this is that, this is that. I think we have multiple forms of capitalist organization that are evolving and cyclical. I'm sure you've talked about this quite a lot. And so I would say the plantation is important both for reasons of domination, but also for reasons of political economy and capital accumulation. There's no industrialization without the profits of West Indian sugar plantations. About a third of the capital formation, England's capital formation in the late 18th century, something that often falls off the map in accounts of fossil capital, and that's important to observe. That lacunae, again, how do we connect the lacunae, is so important because, of course, capital formation is always deeply racialized, is deeply colonial, is deeply gendered, and let's not forget what doesn't appear in the world piece that Gregg and Sophie and Pablo put up. What happened to class? So yes, labor is racialized from the beginning, but race is capitalized from the beginning. And that's the kind of connection that I think we need to be making. We need to put together the two halves of the amulet, of questions of domination, questions of exploitation, and to understand how they are constitutive, co-constitutive in an evolving and dynamic system of reinventing systems of power and reinventing systems of capital accumulation that nevertheless are geographically finite. And that last point helps us see the ultimate vulnerabilities of capitalism in an era when it has encompassed the entire globe. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. So with that, we'll open it up to all of you. I would ask that you introduce yourself, your name, your kind of department background, and before asking a question, and like to keep it initially to grad students. You open it up. Yes, please.
Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Can you stand up though?
Yeah,
We can't see you.
Okay. Hi, I'm Pearlie. Thank you for, I was all along this week. I did on Wednesday, Thursday, and Friday. So I have some questions, Professor Murphy, and some Professor Moore.
Pearlie, can you just say your department?
Oh yeah, I'm in a joint degree of culture anthropology and environmental resources with the Nelson Institute. Can you talk a bit more about the indigenous science and technology studies? How is it differing, apart from the indigenous people doing it, what do you see any major differences between the science and technology studies that are going on? And second is, you mentioned about the contradictions in academic setting when we talk about decolonial thinking. And I was thinking about, as graduate students, we are to cite people. and people who we cite should inform our theories, right? So I'm just wondering whether you can say a little bit more about how you navigate, because a big existing body of knowledge has this colonizing thing undergirding it, and how do we do decolonial thing? I mean, basically the contradiction, but elaborate on how to navigate it, if you can share any of your advice. And Professor, more about, I really like your article of connecting everything together. But I was just wondering, like, how do you think that could be used by practitioners? I don't know whether that's on your mind at all, but do you think that could be a potential of appealing that common framework to particular groups? More like how do you think that could be used to advance changes? Right, thank you.
Sure.
To say a little bit more about science and technology studies, I think an important author to read is Kim Tallbear and her work on indigenous DNA. But if, to kind of characterize the field, it's a relatively new field. It is a pretty small but exciting and growing field. So the question, I think, of like what indigenous technology studies can become is an interesting question right now. But if we think about the history of science that has largely interacted with indigenous people by virtue of extracting from their lives, their bodies, their knowledges, that colonial relation in science also exists in anthropology, in historical study, and so on. So academic work largely has that colonial relation to indigenous people. So in indigenous science studies, the framework tends to be that it's not indigenous people studying indigenous people from the perspective of those disciplines, but it's studying science and technology. And so yes, using the tools, particularly from feminist science and technology, it's really interesting to see that indigenous science technology is often very feminist. But bringing in the values, bringing in the methods, bringing in the epistemologies of indigenous thought, which of course is very varied, to study of science and technology. So that's one way of thinking about it. So you can imagine, because there's not one indigenous thought, that there's many versions of indigenous science and technology study. So people are trying to figure out how do you not just study then science, but then also how can indigenous people practice science and technology in a way that imbued with indigenous values, indigenous methods, indigenous relations. And so that's an interesting question. So that's a little description of what indigenous science and technology is. And your second question was, how can we decolonize in academia when academia is a colonial space? Is that kind of a good summation of it? So yes, the university is profoundly a colonial space. At the same time, there's many traditions of radical work that we can engage while we're at the university. And so in terms of thinking about decolonial potential at the university, one first act is to think about the need to be dismantling things to make room for other things. So the person I, like my kind of go-to on thinking about how to do this is to read Fanon. And, you know, one of the things I've been saying is, like, what would science and technology studies look like if it began with Fanon? If we began with Fanon instead of, let's say, Latour. And, you know, the book Alienation and Freedom just came out, which is, I don't know if folks, you know, have taken a look at this 800-page wonder of, you know, Fanon's writings, in addition to the well-known, you know, books like Wretched of the Earth, Towards African Revolution, and so on. And in that 800-page tome, over 500 pages of it is his scientific writings. Right? So there's just a tremendous amount to learn, I think, from a deep archive of people who have been thinking about the role of science and technology in colonialism, and the question of, at the same time, becoming something else in interaction with science, technology, and medicine. So that question is not the question of undoing, like, the erasure of that past of colonial science and medicine, but it is the question that doesn't make you less indigenous, it doesn't make you less anti-colonial, it doesn't make you less outside of those things when you pick up your computer, or when you know, to use a pencil, or to use a pen, or to do something with numbers. And so this question of how to activate decolonial possibility in the impossibility of undoing coloniality as a historical aftermath is kind of the tension. So that's my kind of thinking about how to do it, is you're kind of doing the impossible, but you're doing it anyways.
Well, I would say just very briefly, world history is not everything, but in everything that all of you study. So, you know, we don't all need to be world historians, but the world looks quite a bit different, and the concepts and theory deploys look very different when viewed from the standpoint of the long run and large scale development of capitalism as an ecology of power, production, and nature. So I would say that first of all, and that philosophy of history and method is about overcoming the fragmentation that characterizes not just most academic work, mainstream academic work, but most radical academic work as well. There's a tremendous fear of a relational holism. And the fact that people have not always handled that question well in the past is not should not be regarded as a sin. And there's a long history of both Marxist and post-structuralist posturing around fragmentation that is equally problematic. So we have to, in my view, to deal with planetary crisis, we need ways of thinking that transcend the limits of modernity, transcend in a dialectical sense. And one of the key moments is we have to be rigorously historical in a civilization that is premised on a deeply ahistorical geoculture. And environmentalism and environmental thought is drawn deeply from that. But also we have to overcome the fragmentation of knowledge. And that speaks to the question of disciplines, but also of how we draw lines, how we draw lines around history, how we draw lines around race, around class, around gender, how we draw the lines between them and the webs of life in which they are all part, and making and being made by.
I'm a PhD student in literary studies here. My question is primarily for Michelle. Sort of what I'm detecting a lot of is this kind of latent emphasis, or maybe not so latent emphasis, on forms of labor management, which is something that I think is really interesting. And I'm wondering how we can sort of chart continuities on forms of labor management across time in a sort of like longue-durée sense. So starting from a kind of premise that links labor management with processes of conversion to Fordism and Taylorism, and more recently, I guess, groups like the French radical collective Tikkun have called cybernetic management. I'm specifically thinking about Kim Tallbear's work on periodization and how it's sort of like as a way to transform indigenous life into data for the preservation of life now. And so I'm wondering if that can sort of be problematized through an emphasis on labor management.
This seems like a Shona question about labor.
Can you sort of elaborate just a little bit more exactly what you mean by labor management?
So I guess in terms of what I was thinking of in terms of cybernetic management was sort of the way in which information is utilized to create or certain sort of groups of people are transformed into data in order to more cogently manage a workspace. And then sort of thinking about that in terms of cryopreservation was the idea of indigenous life being transformed into data so that we can figure out how to survive. And I think that's something that Kim Tallbear sort of emphasizes. So I was just thinking, different groups of people being transformed into data and that being utilized as a kind of form to continue capitalism.
It sounds a little bit like Haraway's Informatics of Domination, right? But the sort of the period that I'm looking at, we don't quite have that statistical approach yet, but we don't have such a statistical approach to labor management. I'm looking at a kind of priorness, you can think of it as management in some form, but the management that is recognizing labor or recognizing the potential of a person's bodily labor. That's the kind of management that I think about in my work. I think Jason thinks about it differently in his work when he talks about, I think, the four cheaps and nature, labor,
food, labor, energy, raw materials.
Yeah, food, labor, energy,
yeah.
Raw materials. But the production, I'm specifically thinking about what you talk about in terms of the production of cheap labor and cheap nature. So that's another way of understanding management, or at least the ends of management of bodies, bodily actions, etc.
And I guess I would say I think looking at this area, of course, people have done a lot of work on Detroit and the history of labor in Detroit, but I've been trying to think much more about land and land relations as opposed to labor relations, and we could say land-body relations as opposed to labor relations. And maybe what connects to what you're saying is the question of practices of extraction. So we think about practices of extraction, we can think about that in terms of labor. We can think of that in terms of the settler-colonial relation to land, turn it into resource. We can think of that in terms of data practices as being extractive. So I don't know if that's kind of like just a dot connecting. Maybe pull out of your question one of the themes maybe about thinking about Plantationocene, Capitalocene, Anthropocene, epistemologies, bodies, and so on, is this relation of extraction, wanting to historicize it, wanting to understand it, wanting to be particular about it. Of course, I'm thinking of Pablo's work on quantification, as maybe he would have the best answer to this question. I don't know.
So can I just add, so for me, I think less about, like, I've done a lot of thinking about land, but what I look at is how and the way that we understand labor in a particular space, in a particular time, is actually used to possess land and articulate rights to land. So that for me, that's what's at stake in labor management, right? Labor has to happen somewhere. So although I don't necessarily start with land, I think it's important to sort of always think about those bodily actions are being performed and how does the way in which we articulate them sort of continue to or facilitate the possession of land. And so in work, I look specifically at the way in which labor, the concept of modern labor that comes out of the plantation, how that is used to ultimately dispossess indigenous peoples and force them off of land.
I know there's some people on the list here, but I'm just I'm wondering if, because the land is been definitely a kind of analytic category within our discussions around the plantation, and it was in the three papers that you shared. I mean, it was really striking to me, the way in which land, particularly land, labor, land body relations was appearing both in your work, Michelle, and your work, Shona, and somewhat absent in yours, Jason. I'm interested.
I thought it was fundamental.
Well, except that it's not one of your cheaps, and so there's a way, and land is like within STS is not something. It's not been an analytic category at all. And so I'm really interested if we could explore a little bit about the kind of work that land is doing, or land, labor, land body relations are doing in each of your work, and how central it is or peripheral it is in that space.
Well, where you saw no land, the frontier is the question.
Frontier,
the
sure.
frontier is the land. It's the
Right.
basis for the periodic restoration of the four chiefs: labor, food, energy, and raw materials. I'll hand it over to the rest.
What fascinates me about the sort of labor-land relation is the way in which labor does something very specific to land. And this sort of ties in with the larger histories of capital. And I think Jason's work actually explains this to a great degree. And I'm forgetting which piece exactly. But labor allows land to be captured by something that we might think of as almost metaphysical, but it allows it to be captured by time, right? And time is what ultimately allows the labor-land relation to be productive, and then productive for capitalist or for capital accumulation. And so, again, that's what I sort of find fascinating about it.
So, in thinking about land, I feel like I have to think about it with like a double consciousness or like a two-wide seeing, and thinking about, on the one hand, attending to, and then this will connect to what I think Jason is thinking about, and Shona's thinking about, land resource, land as a cheap, that kind of capital's view of land, settler colonial's view of land, land as property, land as territory, all of that. But then I also, have to be thinking about land in another way. So thinking about land, sometimes people say capital L land. Capital L land is not land as territory, or just earth. That's land in all its relations, right? That's land as in a fulsomeness of its living relations that include ancestors, include those yet to come, that include beings that you can't see, that include the animals and the plants. And this understanding of land is also connected to body, so your body is also land, like it's part of land. There's a land-body relation, which is a past and a future. It's not just your body is one kind of scale and land is another kind of scale. And so land is also like who you are. Land is what is full of obligations. Those relations are logical connections. It's like you have agreements and obligations with the land that makes possible existence. And so this understanding of land is really different. And so one of the questions was, what does indigenous science and technology studies do? So what does it mean to have a really different relation to land, in which land itself is also something different that a scientific category or ecological category or the state category understands land to be, and bring that into your obligations of interacting with knowledge making. So that's, I guess, a question about a land. And here I think about work like Marisol de la Cadena's work on thinking about, land can also be beings, right? Earth, there's land can be with you in political action. Marisol de la Cadena makes the important point that one of the ways that colonialism works, that capitalism works, is to make a claim that there is one nature, that there's one version of nature. And we have our concepts of like ecology and land and animals and plants and air and water is like what makes sense of an entire planet. And there's many other ways of apprehending what makes up the world and what are its beings. Like who are peoples, and what is alive, and so on. And so I think, attending to land is so important, because on a historical side, it really brings us to the specificity of place. On analysis of colonialism and capitalism and racial capitalism, it's a key part of the formation of violent systems. And then, so there's the other land bodies that are there and are not just in resistance to capitalism and colonialism, but are already there on their own terms. And so I feel really important place to start, and that's maybe my attraction to not the Plantationocene part, but like the starting with plantation, because it starts us with land.
But I pose this question, the problem with a kind of Anglo-centric Marxism is precisely that it fuses property and land. For me, I would see the origins of modern property in the slave. And so that changes how we look at the question of land. I agree with everything you're saying. I wonder if there's a kind of Anglo-centric privileging of land that we maybe want to step beyond to see the origins of property and to sort of turn Brenner inside out and to see the origins in the slave trade and enslavement and in the two middle passages that Shona is bringing out.
It reminds me of Malcolm X, Plymouth Rock landed on us.
I'm sorry, could you
Right.
speak up?
No, just when Malcolm X says that Plymouth Rock sort of landed on us, right? And so that sort of captures the idea of the body as land.
Mm.
Yeah.
Mm. Yeah. So, Ada and Andrew, and then, yeah. Yeah, please.
Hi, good morning. My name is Ida. I'm a first year PhD student in cultural anthropology. I particularly appreciate the way you look at the category of religion and its interdependence with political economy. And from your work, it's pretty much obvious how Christian theology and religion for different purposes and different manifestations. And I was wondering if you could speak a little bit more about that and how do we see the historical trajectory of this interdependence, whether it's still relevant, or does it lose its relevance, or if you could just develop more on this. Thank you.
So, so in in sort of the work that I'm doing now, I am fascinated by not so much, like we can talk about the complicity of the church in colonization, but how does it actually, right? How does religion actually play a part in that? And so that's what I'm trying to figure out, and so that's why I talk a lot about conversion and Las Casas, and I think that one of the things that I'm trying to do is, I live in a really conservative state, so I'm trying to be careful. But one of the things that I'm trying to do is push back against the idea that religion is somehow unconnected from economy, just like culture is unconnected from economy. I think we have to understand how they sort of mutually shape each other. And so that's why I argue that the conversion, that religious conversion, again, I'm going to the New World to convert people, et cetera, it's not just an economic on Columbus's part, right? On the part of merchants and everybody, all the group of people that's trying to sort of push back against the social order of the time, but it's also a conversion on the part of of religious folks like Las Casas, and it's an economic conversion that doesn't get articulated as such. We articulate it as an economic conversion. How does that change what we actually not so much even understand about religion, but how we understand about economics, organizes bodies, how it works, or the sort of non-economic means through which it actually works. So yeah. I mean, I don't know if that answers your question. I didn't want to get too deep into the longer argument.
And what about in terms of his point about periodization and its relevance? Is there a point where it becomes no longer relevant?
You mean religion in the discussion?
Yeah.
Oh no.
I mean, I think this is yeah.
I think it's always relevant. I find it interesting that we sort of break the world into halves, right? We talk about religious man, and then religious man goes through, Tilly Winter talks about this, right? Man 1 and man 2. So there's religious man, and then there's homo politicus, and eventually we have homo economicus, right? But if you think about the fact that religion was one way of organizing the self, Europe, non-European others, and it's a way that actually becomes translated into and subsumed within race, within racial capital, and the production of the homo economicus. It's something that is always present. But again, the sort of the great trick of time is to see it as something that is marginal. So, it's religion is over there, the church is over there, religious fundamentalism, everything is over there, but that's bound up with race and capital always.
Andrew.
Hi, I'm Andrew. Oh my goodness. Hi, I'm Andrew, I'm a literature student. I also had a question for Shona. In the article that you circulated, I was really fascinated by the way that you historicize the dialectic between labor and work. And I was wondering whether you see the work in the labor of non-human actors as participating in that dialectic, or is even being invisible from that dialectic.
And non-factors you're referring to?
Plants, for example.
It's possible. It's possible. And so I don't think about non-human actors. But again, so if we reject the sort of nature-culture division, and the goal of the project is to recover, again, bodily actions that can't be accounted for in terms of capitalist processes as either paid or unpaid work, right? So capital, as Jason has sort of reinforced, depends a lot on unpaid work. But there is this, I don't see why the bodily actions that don't fall into the category of either paid or unpaid work, I don't see why we can't have a way of thinking about them and understanding them. And also, I don't see why they couldn't then be linked with, the sort of actions of labor that, of nature, that don't fall into either of those. So I think the labor work dialectic, and I'm still trying to think through it. But the whole idea is to create space, right? So on the one hand, it has to do a specific thing. It has to figure out, for me at least, as a Guyanese, as a Caribbeanist, it has to figure out how we can stop Indigenous peoples from labor discourse, because again, labor is tied to rights, et cetera, but it also must really create space or create a gap within. Again, we can think of all of these other movements, actions. So it could be literally grass growing, right? Or a body walking on grass or cutting grass for no reason, or being in nature that has no, in maybe an effective way. And so this goes back to something that you were saying yesterday, but being in nature in an effective way, something that literally can be captured by or within the terms that we have. So although I don't necessarily think of non-human actors, I think it is a way of, I don't really like the divide. So that's another problem. I don't really like the divide between human and non-human actors. So the hope is that we can think of all of these processes of growth, of movement, life, in a more relational way rather than an either or way. And I think that sort of dialectic is one way of trying to create space. Yesterday I gave the example of my mom and her, and her siblings literally eating $1. But we think that the dollar is the thing that mediates the relationship with nature. My suggestion is no, that all of these things are part of each other, all of these things are connected, and so we have to sort of refuse that resistance, because it leaves us very limited sorts of ways of thinking about the things that we do.
Monique and then Ian. So Monique. So we're opening it up now to.
Sorry for, I was just excited to ask a question. So, I wanted
Can you introduce yourself, Monique?
What?
Can you introduce yourself?
Oh yes, I'm Monique, and I am a associate professor in the English department, and I'm one of the co-organizers of the seminar. And so one of the things that I was struck by in reading Shona's and Michelle's work in particular was the way that it's a problem of settler colonialism, and the ways that thinking about settler colonialism really makes clear that analysis of capitalism or of the plantation on its own
is not a sufficient analytic. You know, there needs to be something else. So I was hoping, and I suppose the reasons for me why analysis of capitalism or plantation is not a sufficient analytic would be that it's too easy if we only focus on capitalism and how it's worked, or we only focus on plantation. It's too easy to proceed as though genocide of indigenous persons and the appropriation of native lands had actually happened as of the past, or was, you know, completed, right? So that's one of the things clear to me. So I was just would love to hear all of you sort of talk a bit about settler colonialism and how that sort of shifts the kinds of analytics that we have to take on about the conjoined problems of our moment, environmental, economic, and cultural problems, right, which are all sort of put together, and also what kinds of other analytics does this require of us? What other kinds of, and I think we see some of that by the end of Shona's work. So that's just the question, is to think about the relation of settler colonialism and capitalism, and what thinking about settler colonialism opens up for us and requires that we do that we might not if we just focused on capitalism or we just focused on the plantation.
Wanna start?
Oh, I was just thinking I need my second cup of coffee. But,
Go for
it. So I don't know if you
We
could
could
start,
put-
I
we could
might
take-
have my second cup of coffee, or I can begin and then you can go and I can maybe come back. Yeah.
Or we could take a break. Let's take a break and let everybody gather their thoughts.
Okay.
And then we'll come back. How's that?
That sounds
First
really
dibs for
good.
you, though,
Yeah.
on the coffee. Go,
I was really
go,
feeling it.
Go.
Unfortunately, I cannot drink coffee, so I
Oh, no.
yeah, I can only drink tea and like small amounts.
I think there's hot water there, though. Okay, good, good.
Oh, no, I have tea. I have tea. Yeah.
No.
The last thing you said was extraordinary. The last thing you were saying.
Okay, and I don't remember.
And I was thinking, I was gonna jump in there too in terms of thinking about metabolism and growth, and the way in which work plays out different, across your.
I mean,
your-
there are
the way
different
that people-
discussions going on. There's a discussion around the concepts and ideas we use in storytelling, and then there's a discussion of what are the stories of actually existing changes that are we going to focus on. And usually we